right. We may still have a few folks filing in, but let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to Bridge to Adulthood, a discussion on California's extended foster care system. I'm Sara Tiano, a senior reporter for the Imprint, and I will be serving as the moderator for this great panel. And I will introduce everyone in just a minute. First, I'd like to give a quick word about our producer. Fostering Media Connections is a national California-based nonprofit that uses the power of media and journalism to lead the conversation about children, youth, and families in America. We publish the Imprint, which is a daily news site covering child welfare, youth justice, and youth homelessness, as well as Fostering Families Today, which is a print magazine delivered into the households of foster and kinship families across the country. We also operate the Youth Voice program, which offers journalism and writing coaching, internships, and other opportunities to youth and young adults who have experienced these systems. And before we roll into today's program, I'd also like to give a quick word of thanks to the Walter S. Johnson Foundation and the Louis L. Borick Foundation, which are both longtime supporters of our work covering child welfare in California and help make this event possible today. So we have a wonderful panel here today to discuss what has changed for foster youth since extended care came to California, what the research says about the impact of the program's first 10 years, and how policy experts think it could improve moving forward. We have Janay Eustace, the executive director of the California Youth Connection, which is one of the most powerful youth advocacy organizations in the country. Janay experienced California's foster system prior to extended foster care and advocated for its passage both at the state and federal levels. Jordan Sosa also joins us from the California Youth Connection, where he serves as the statewide legislative and policy manager. Jordan also has lived experience in California's extended foster care system, in addition to his policy expertise. Amy Lemley is the executive director of John Burton Advocates for Youth, which is a nonprofit that conducts research and advocacy to improve the lives of teens and young adults who have experienced foster care and homelessness. And finally, Mark Courtney, professor at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Practice and Policy, and the principal investigator of the Cal Youth Study, which has examined the impact of the state's extended foster care program. That's an exciting panel to look forward to. But before I kick it over to these wildly knowledgeable folks, I want to give us all a little background on extended foster care so that we're all on the same page. In the mid-2000s, Mark's team at the University of Chicago began releasing reports that followed former foster youth from Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois into their early adult years. And the youth in Iowa and Wisconsin in that study exited care at 18, while the youth in Illinois exited the system at 21. And the research showed that the youth thrust into adulthood without any permanent place to call home fared pretty poorly when it came to academics and employment, and also became disproportionately involved in the justice system and reliant on public benefits later in life. So it wasn't long before Congress acted on the growing evidence. In 2008, former President George W. Bush signed into law the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, a mouthful, more commonly called just Fostering Connections. This law offered states matching federal funds to help states that wanted to extend foster care to age 21. And before this law, federal funding for foster care under Title IV-E ended at age 18. Now, for states to participate in this federally supported extended foster care program, there are certain unique requirements. Some of that has been relaxed during the pandemic to allow kids a little leeway and grace as the challenges have unfolded over the last year. But outside of these relaxed standards, generally youth are required to be pursuing education or be employed unless they have a disability that prevents them from either of those. So what has happened since? That was 2008. As we remember, not a great economic time for most of the country. And that is part of the reason why not a lot of states jumped in early on to the extended foster care opportunity. They didn't want to add too much extra cost to their budgets at the time. But over the past 10 years, since federal funding came available, all but one state, Oklahoma, now have some form of extended foster care. And some states offer very limited extension of services, but most do help with housing and case management services for youth beyond 18. Just over half of the states that are participating in extended foster care do so with this federal support from 2008's Fostering Connections Act. Now, here in California, we were one of the earliest adopters after federal funding became available. Assembly Bill 12, or AB 12, was signed in 2010 and took effect in 2012. And that brought extended foster care to California, as many of you know. We all know AB 12 around here. In California, it provides young people with a monthly stipend to cover housing costs and other basic needs, along with case management services. And in California's system, participants are allowed to choose where they live, so they can be with relatives, foster families, and independent living programs. But throughout participating in the program, they remain subject to court oversight, and they can be dismissed from the program at any point if they fail to meet the participation requirements. So now we're closing in on a decade of extended foster care in California, which at this point can really be looked at as the primary safety net for youth when counties fail to find permanency for them as children in the foster care system. Extended foster care is a chance to keep housing stability for young adults as they pursue education or launch their career, and it's 3 extra years to ensure that they get connected to the services to help them thrive as adults that they have a right to. So thank you for indulging me in that little spiel. And with that, I would like to pass it over to Janay, who, like I said earlier, has had a front row seat to this entire process, first experiencing foster care when it ended at 18 and then advocating to its extension to 21, and now leading this massively powerful youth advocacy group shaping state child welfare policy in California. So Janay, can you tell us a little bit about what aging out in foster care was like before it was extended and how you came to be involved in the advocacy to bring about extended foster care?
Of course. Thank you so much, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I'm so proud to be here today. It feels like a full circle moment. You know, the best part I think about not only being the executive director for California Youth Connection, but being a part of what extension of foster care is today, is that I remember being a CYC member myself. My journey really started in California Youth Connection. I became a member of the Sacramento chapter in California at a very young age, and just learned and listened to so many, and really saw so many of my peers, and like we like to refer to each other as my foster brothers and sisters, who were aging out. And all of a sudden they were involved in CYC, and then they weren't, and then they didn't have help, and they would come more to the meetings asking for help and looking for support. And we just saw this constant unprepared, this unpreparedness that was happening, where all of our older and what we would call the OGs of CYC, as they were aging out and turning 18, those who we looked up to, finding themselves in really hard places, and without connections, and without a safety net, without lifelong connections and housing opportunities. Those families that they were once connected to, or those programs, no longer able to offer services and support, and just really feeling alone. And a lot of times finding themselves in many of the other systems, like the mental health system, and finding themselves incarcerated even, and just in a lot of predicaments that really showed by not having actual support and lifelong connections. In CYC, we talked about this a lot. There was many conversations of what could the system be like if it supported young people through their after 18 and through their adulthood, and what could that look like? And I remember first dreaming and understanding what that could be through listening to my foster brothers and sisters. Before AB 12 passed, We talked about different iterations of what extension of foster care could look like. I know it was always an ongoing conversation and always looking to other states even and other young people to hear, is there anything like that anywhere else? You know, what does your permanency look like? I mean, we started using the words of the system because we wanted so badly to have those connections after care. For me personally, it was the fire of hearing my brothers and sisters going through all that they were, that we kept carrying that voice in CYC and really pushing and pushing. And CYC, California Youth Connection, being connected to so many different organizations actually afforded me the opportunity to go and do congressional office visits on the Hill for fostering connection. And that was an amazing experience. That was actually started in about 2005. We started doing that work. So as a young girl, I was able to travel to DC and really learn about what that aspect of advocacy looked like, right? In California, we had it our way, and I got to go to DC and learn how to do those congressional office visits there. And I remember how proud I was to be able to carry the voice of so many of the CYC members that I had heard for so many years as I was newly aging out of foster care myself. You know, and it was an experience of its own, because here it is, I was actually living what a 19-year-old, exiting a system was experiencing. And there was many transitions. I look back at those times and I laugh, and even seeing some of the names who are here with us today, and even seeing Amy, you know, on this panel. I mean, she got a glimpse of what 19-year-old Janay was looking like and experiencing during those times. So it's really amazing to see the journey of where we are today, and to be able to again just do those congressional office visits and really push and really and not only push, but having the humbling experience of being able to work in CYC's policy team in 2012 as we were then implementing AB 12 in California. And that was an amazing experience where we had multiple CYC interns, young people. They were 14 to 24, and we were sitting on all these state work groups and really talking about what still needed to be very clear in this law. And more than anything, we wanted it to be inclusive. We didn't want it to be exclusive. We didn't want those requirements to be so heavy and such a heavy lift that it excluded so many young people, because what we knew is that those who were faring worse, who were not doing well, needed AB 12 the most. And so we were very proud to get some of those conditions in about removing barriers and still having access to the extension of foster care dollars then. We're very proud of adding in that medical exception, right? Because we knew many of us have so many, so much to deal with after leaving care. So we were so proud to have those eligibility requirements added, and really pushed and fought for those at the state level, and wanting to be a part of what that implementation was in California. So quite the journey. Again, it feels like a full circle moment being here today and now talking about, let's look at AB 12. This is where we're at 10 years later. It feels so special to be here today, and it's a real honor. Thank you.
Janay, thank you so much. And fellow audience members, if you, like me, had about 1,000 questions that you wanted to ask Janay while you listened to her great presentation, please go ahead and drop those in the chat, because we will save some time for questions at the end of today's hour. Jordan, just wanted to see if you have anything you'd like to add from your perspective on AB 12 passing and the before and after.
Yeah, of course. First, just thank you, and I appreciate the invitation to this discussion, not only just sharing just the lived experience of an extended foster care, but elevating the youth voice and the membership voice. And really wanted to give a special shout out to all the youth advocates and CYC members that made AB 12 possible. That was kind of the flagship in being introduced to California Youth Connection, and something that astonished me so much of AB 12, that even though there were advocates were advocating for something that they possibly couldn't benefit from personally, that they paved the way for future foster youth like myself to access extended foster care. And I for sure wouldn't be where I'm at if it wasn't for their support. And what I could share just currently working as a legislative and policy manager, that CYC members are still advocating for the same thing that youth were advocating in the passage of the foster Fostering Connections to Success Act in 2008, we want to ensure that all young people exiting foster care receive the support, services, and opportunities that will allow the individual to grow into healthy adulthood. I think one thing that members and youth advocates have perceived AB 12 as an entitlement program by law as young adults are aging out, having the right to receive services through extended foster care up to the age of 21. This could be with accessing a social worker, placement support, and receive coordinated services based on an individual's independent living plan. But what we see is an entitlement program. How do youth have shared that they have to share their worth or showing proof of being a productive member of society to access these services? And I would say that, COVID-19 really shook and really flipped that narrative of, are these qualifications realistic for all youth wanting to access extended foster care? So one thing I do want to leave from this discussion is how will policymakers and child welfare stakeholders create a safety net that honors and nourishes all individuals impacted by California's foster care system? This is definitely more than just a monthly stipend or check the box out to see if they filled their TILP or SILP form. This is more than just a monthly visit to see that if the youth is meeting the AB 12 requirements. We all, as advocates and stakeholders of the child welfare system, must work towards a system that will give the power back to the young people. And that is one thing that I just really appreciate working with CYC members. Like, how are we getting that power back and having the opportunity to dream and thrive and achieve the goals that we want to achieve, not what's just outlined in the court plan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective and shouting out the shoulders of the youth who have done so much work to pave the way in the early days. So I'm excited for all of us to talk more about policy fix ideas a little bit later in the hour. But for now, I would like to throw it over to Mark, who led the Cal Youth Study, which looks at the outcomes over time of how extended foster care has impacted youth in the system in California. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about what you found in that study?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me. It's really, really great to be with this group and to talk about what we've learned a decade into extended foster care. I'm going to talk, can you put next slide, please? So what I'm going to do today in a very short period of time is describe briefly the California Youth Transitions to Adulthood Study, Cal Youth. And I should start by saying, all you have to do if you want to find everything I'm saying here now in much more detail is just type Cal Youth Study in any web browser, and it'll take you to either the Chapin Hall website where we have all the reports. Also, the California Child Welfare Co-Investment Partnership website has links to our reports and also presentations. I also want to thank our funders, Conrad Hilton Foundation, Walter S. Johnson Foundation, RISA Foundation, and Zellerbach Family Foundation, and California Wellness Foundation, who funded the work I'm going to talk about specifically today. And that work includes summarizing trends and key outcomes youth experience between 17 and 23, and also summarizing our findings on the influence of extended care on youth outcomes through age 23. And what I'm going to do is really focus on the most recent round of data analysis we did, looking at the impact of extended care after young people have actually left extended care. In other words, does extended care have legs, if you like? Next slide, please. So this is Cal Youth. It is an evaluation of the implementation of AB 12 in California. And it's in partnership with the California Child Welfare Co-Investment Partnership, which includes the State Child Welfare Agency, county agencies, the Judicial Council of California, and the philanthropic community. And we're trying to answer three questions. What impact does extended foster care have on well-being outcomes of young adults? What factors influence the supports that youth receive through extended foster care? Who gets what and why? And then in particular, how do living arrangements and other supports that are actually created by extended foster care, transitional living programs, supervised independent living placements, how do those mediate, if you like, drive the relationship between extended foster care and the outcomes we observe if we see impacts of extended foster care? And what Cal Youth consists of in terms of data, I think the part folks know most about is a longitudinal study we've done of young people transitioning to adulthood from foster care starting early in the implementation of AB 12 before all of these young people were even eligible. I'll provide a little more detail on that in a minute. Periodic surveys of child welfare workers who actually provide services to those young people, and then analysis of government program administrative data. So that's a much larger sample. The youth survey follows 727 young people, all of whom came of age while extended foster care was in place. Our administrative data actually go all the way back to 2006, and they allow us to look at outcomes for a much larger sample, over 100,000 young people, and look at change over time before the law went into effect and after the law went into effect. Next slide, please. So this is the youth survey. You can see that back in 2013, we were able to identify and interview 95% of a sample of young people who had been in foster care in California for at least 6 months and were between 16 3/4 and 17 3/4 years old. So they were all younger than the point where they would transition to extended foster care. And we've been able to follow over 4/5 of them, that group, all the way to age 23. And we asked lots of questions, spent an hour and a half talking to them, asked a lot about their prior experiences, their current functioning, aspirations, etc. Next slide. So I'm going to summarize very briefly trends on outcomes in key areas between 17 and 23. And actually, our most recent report provides nice graphics that show these trends. There's a declining enrollment in school, but that's because everybody's in school at 17, like 95% of them are in high school. There's going to need to be. But significant number of youths are still enrolled in college, even at age 23. And this mirrors what I found earlier in the Midwest study, that in many ways, these young people are just behind their peers in some ways. They're doing things that other young people do, but quite often it's taking them a bit longer. So there's a lot of them still in college at 23. There's increasing employment over this period of time between 17 and 23, and stabilizes that around 2/5 of these young people are employed at the time we interview them. More like 3/4 over the course of a year will be employed in these later years. Increasing percentage of youth are parents of children, but males are much more likely than the females to be non-custodial parents. And that again is consistent with what we found earlier in other studies as well. A troubling level of involvement with the criminal justice system, but actually at significantly lower rates in this study than we observed in the Midwest study in any of the states that we followed. So I think that's some very good news just in terms of general trends. And then lastly, over 2/3 of these young people are connected to either school or work as young adults. Next slide. So then the real meat of what I want to talk about today, does extended foster care have legs? So the purpose of our most recent report, and there's a link to it, is really to look at outcomes up to age 23. And we look both at a lot of these outcomes, have young people experienced these outcomes at any point between 17 and 23, but also we focus on that period of time between 21 and 23. And the reason for that is there was a lot of skepticism, I think, on the part of a lot of folks. Okay, you let people stay in care till 21, but it all falls apart for them after that. And so we want to, follow outcomes after the age of 21 to see if there's some persistence of those outcomes. We looked at about 24 outcomes, lots of them, and they span lots of developmental domains. So education, employment, economic hardships, family formation, health, and criminal justice system involvement, but others as well. So next slide. What I'm going to do now is this is focused on the youth survey. I'm going to talk in a minute about the administrative data because of somewhat different outcomes there. And to remind you, what we're doing here is we're looking at a group of young people as they transition to adulthood, and we're trying to assess the impact or relationship between how long they remain in extended foster care and later outcomes. And we do that by statistically controlling as best we can for everything we know about these young people, which is a lot in terms of their functioning, background, et cetera, and the context they're in, county context, things like the employment rate in the county, cost of housing in county, things like that. And this table summarizes some of our findings around the impact or influence, if you like, of extended care and outcomes. And the arrows point to the key thing to focus on. So we found that every year additional and extended care, and these young people on average spend about 2 years in care, so you give a sense of how important this is. Every year increases the probability they complete high school by about 8 percentage points, increase their expected probability of ever enrolling in college by 10 to 12 percentage points, increase the expected probability of enrolling in college since the last interview. So again, this is between 21 and 23, by 7%, and also increase their expected probability of actually completing a 2 or 4 year college degree that's overwhelmingly 2-year degrees by about 3 percentage points. It also had a positive impact on employment. Every year in care increased their probability of working in the past year for 3 or more months by about 5 percentage points, and increase the amount of money youth had in their bank accounts by about $640. That doesn't sound like a lot, but given how much they're earning, it's actually quite a bit. Next slide. We also had impacts on other outcomes, not just employment and education. So it decreased every year, decreased the receipt of need-based public food assistance, SNAP, by about $140 a year, decreased the odds of meeting the USDA food insecurity standard of food insecurity by about 1/5, decreased the odds of homelessness or couch surfing since their last interview. So again, this is between 21 and 23. So they're not in care. Nevertheless, how long they remained in care before that decreased every year in care, decreased the odds of homelessness or couch surfing by about 1/5, decreased the number of times they were homeless, and decreased the number of days they were homeless. It also decreased the odds that youth had been arrested since their last interview, and increased the likelihood that young people felt they had adequate social support. Next slide. But there are a lot of outcomes it didn't have an impact on. Didn't have an impact on earnings from employment, number of economic hardships, physical and behavioral health, et cetera. So, we don't find that has an impact on everything, but it certainly has an impact on a lot of things. But I think it suggests there's still room for improvement. Next slide. This is real briefly, this is the administrative data. So these are similar outcomes that we looked at before, but this relies on a much larger sample and allows us to look at change over time. And we do this in 2 ways. We look at just, before and after extended foster care, how long you remain in care, clearly that changed. We also take advantage of the fact that there's differences between counties and how inclusive they were, if you like, and how likely young people to remain in care. There's actually significant differences within California. That's that right-hand column there that has IV model. I'm not going to get into describing that, but these are somewhat different ways of looking at this question. And basically what we find is very similar outcomes to what we find when we talk to the youth and look at that group that aged out. Increasing the odds of enrollment in college, increasing the odds that they ever enrolled in college between 21 and 23, increasing the likelihood they had a degree, and so on, also increasing employment. But if you look at the right, you see some NS's there. And that means that when we take advantage of this other method, it raises some questions about whether extended care is having an impact on some of these outcomes. Next slide. So when we look at this administrative data, there's a couple of things that I think we want to be cautious about. And that is, we really have weaker evidence that young people are persisting between 2023 and that they're persisting in college generally associated with extended care. Much stronger evidence that they're more likely to enroll in college because they're in extended care. Less strong evidence that they're actually continuing to persist from one semester to the next or to complete their degrees. So next slide. So in conclusion, the findings of this analysis looking at outcomes through age 23 actually are very similar to prior analyses we did on the impact of extended care at age 19, 21. That's very good news. It's particularly good news because they're not in care. These are lasting benefits. So it appears to influence a wide range of outcomes, and we've actually found no evidence of harm associated with extended foster care. So, thanks.
Wow, wonderful. Mark, thank you so much. As somebody who has reviewed your work regularly, I still learned something. And folks, I just want to let you know, we did drop the links to both Mark's Cal Youth study and the Midwest study from the early 2000s that I mentioned earlier. Both of those links are available for you in the chat. Now, Amy, I would love to hear from you. Your group has been keeping a hawk's eye on AB 12 and its evolution over the last 10 years. Can you tell us a little bit about how it has changed since its inception?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me on today. It's a real pleasure to be here and just have the opportunity to reflect on this important policy. First, I want to say that we talk about AB 12, but the minute AB 12 was passed, it started to change. In quick succession, there were a number of kind of cleanup bills. We kind of took the word cleanup to their absolute maximum in terms of kind of modifying the policy. And in the 10 years since, the policy really has continued to change and adapt and change and adapt. And I went back and looked at anywhere from about, I have 25 different kind of laws that have passed that have impacted, the experience of older youth in foster care. So I think that that's really important to remember, that it is changing and it's evolving, and as Mark's information shares, it needs to keep doing that. We see from his outcomes that there are some very positive associations, but we don't want to stop there. We need to, it's delightful, it's wonderful, and we're glad that that's the case, but we know it's not going far enough. And so that's just one thing to share. I think for us, some of the most encouraging progress we've seen that's reinforced by Mark's data, as well as additional data, is young people in extended foster care reaching higher education. Just in the last 5 years, we've seen the number of young people enrolled in community colleges in California go from 26,000 to 42,000. And we've also seen increases in their grade point averages, their completion of transfer courses, their actually attainment of degrees and certifications. So kind of across every metric, we've seen better outcomes. And we've also seen the disparity between the experience of foster youth and non-foster youth. So we're really encouraged with that progress, but there's a lot more progress to make. We know there are areas specifically around retention where the progress is not there. The other thing I just want to say before we kind of move on to, I think what we're really all excited talking about is, areas to improve extended foster care, is the issue of housing. Specifically, when we all worked on AB 12, the idea was most young people would not be living in a supervised independent living placement. It's almost novel. We envisioned that was for a very select number of young people who didn't need a lot of support, because we knew that was the one placement that really doesn't offer any supportive services. However, today over 40% of young people have chosen a SILP as their placement or are not able to access their chosen placement. We know there's over 500 young people on the wait list for THP NMD, and that number has doubled in the last 2 years. And so that was kind of an unexpected development, and something that raises concern for us and for many more, because we think that SILP is great if young people want to live there, but that they should have the opportunity to get support at the level that they want to achieve the goals that they identify. So that is another thing just to mention in terms of when AB 12 was created, what the vision for housing options were. No one ever imagined we would have young people in care who are actually experiencing homelessness. And that's a real, frankly, a disappointment for all of us, because this is a entitlement program. And so again, not to sidestep the achievement of the program, because it is significant and it's a lot to be proud of in California. But that's one specific area where, as well as others that we'll talk later in the conversation, where we think we need to do a lot better.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you, Mark, as well. That was a really good reflection on the first 10 years of extended foster care in California. And I, like Amy mentioned, I'm also very excited to move to the next part of our discussion about what policy changes might help address some of these cracks that have been identified in the system during the first 10 years. Before we move on, I do want to flag a series on the Imprint that some of you might remember from last year. It was a 4-part series that was released last summer called Fostering Adults, that looked at the first 10 years in California of extended foster care. And we interviewed dozens of current and former foster youth in extended care and out of extended care, as well as judges, policymakers, legislators, and advocates. And our findings really highlight a lot of the things that the folks today have talked about. Like Amy mentioned, housing is a huge issue. There are youth in our stories, Peter in Silicon Valley and Maritza in the Bay Area, who both fell into homelessness either while eligible for foster care or in foster care because of the lack of stable housing options available for them. And also probably most significantly, the resounding sentiment that we heard from folks across the board was that 3 years in extended care is just not enough for many young people to really gain independence. Like Mark mentioned earlier, we've seen that a lot of foster youth are on the same track as their peers, just a little bit farther behind. And so a lot of folks expressed how much help it would have brought them if they had a little bit more time to stabilize and take advantage of the resources and opportunities that the extended foster care program has brought to them. And among those was State Senator Jim Bell, who was the senator that first authored AB 12. And he's, after 10 years of watching extended foster care in action, he really fought to extend the time limit until age 25, because he felt that that would really help kids make another step forward in their progress toward the outcomes that we'd all love to see. So all of those stories are available on our website, imprintnews.org, in our special series section. And we will also drop a link to that in the chat if you just want to go through and read about Peter and Maritza and some of the other young people that can kind of bring these issues to life for you. So now it's what we've all been waiting for. Let's talk future. Let's talk policy changes. And again, just to remind everybody in the audience, we are saving the last 10 minutes or so for your questions. So please drop them in the chat. And I would like to first kick it to Jordan as the, legislative brain of CYC. What is CYC's view of how to improve on today's extended foster care system?
Yeah, thank you. And funny to hear the brain. But the first step always of implementing any policy in child welfare is to engage with the individuals that will be impacted from these state policies. And I think we're coming to a unique moment in California right now with the rollout of the Universal Basic Income program for different populations, and foster youth being one of those populations that will qualify. I think is really essential of how California will be listening to the experience of individuals who will be impacted. This will include youth, families, advocate, lawyers, staff, court staff, and the service providers in the community that will be supporting young people in extended foster care. And I think it's essential to hear the existing challenges that are in place. And just from working with young leaders in California Youth Connection, just hearing experiences when individuals experience like failed adoption, or have experienced reunification prior to the age of 16, or have experience in the hidden foster care system, or were placed in informal kinship care, how they have barriers or are ineligible of receiving extended foster care, and how being qualified for AB 12 would have been a huge benefit of their experience transitioning to adulthood, as well as addressing some of the complexities of navigating a county-run system. Just from personal experience, coming from foster care in Los Angeles County and then moving away, whether it was for work or educational purposes, I had the privilege to be connected to CYC and great organizations that serve current and former foster youth. However, I was ineligible for a lot of services since I was not in their county of origin, and personally experienced a long wait list of transitional housing programs, and my case originated from that, I was ineligible to receive those housing services. And with Amy Tide, I really want to emphasize housing, because that is one of the biggest issues that members have been addressing, especially in the impact of COVID-19. Members have been doing a lot of advocacy, even in the federal level, of housing vouchers, whether it's the Family Unification Program housing vouchers or the Foster Youth Independent housing vouchers. Members and youth have experienced this predicament of, if I want to obtain housing stability in the route of going through the FUP or FYI housing voucher, then I am ineligible to qualify for extended foster care in the state of California. So imagine being an 18-year-old, we're being in predicament. It's like, do you want to receive these services that you're eligible up to age 21, or do you want to take a gamble and access the housing voucher? And that is just a lot of weight and burden and putting on an individual when having to pick one of those two paths. So there is a lot of reform happening, and like I mentioned, it's more than just a paycheck, more than just filling the checkbox of like, how are we giving that power back, and how are we making sure that we're supporting the overall well-being of an individual, not just focusing on one aspect of their lives.
Wonderful. That's really great insight. And I think probably leaves a lot of food for thought for folks in the audience. Janay, do you have anything you'd like to add from the CYC perspective?
Jordan definitely said it all. And I would just say that these are the stories that we hear all the time from our current members. And I want to say that CYC members are super involved. They understand state legislation. They understand the big bosses and the landscape of California, right? And even they have experienced being eligible for AB 12 and not actually being, and like having to advocate for their eligibility. And so we're talking about young people who who know the landscape, and this is a part of CYC, right? And they're still advocating at the county level that no, I am eligible, because there's still that eligibility, the issue of not all who are eligible actually being able to be a part of AB 12. And I just wanted to highlight that once again. I know that Jordan definitely talked about it, but just wanted to, say even our most informed young people, right, are still not receiving the services that they should be, that they're eligible for.
That's an incredibly important point to make. And, if the folks who have all of the training, knowledge, support to do it are struggling, it's not a great sign for other kids and young adults. Amy, same question for J-Bay. What law or policy changes from y'all's perspective would improve the quality of the safety net for youth moving to adulthood?
Lot of thoughts here. I guess one thing I would say on the housing front, we need to reframe our thinking about housing, not to what percentage of young people will need help, to how can we help every young person. 52% of 18 to 30-year-olds in the United States of America are adult children living with their parents. So this is the whole country of young adults. We need to move away from, we need this small percentage of young people will need housing supports, and everyone else is going to magically integrate into the market. That's just not the case. And so it's really going to take a reframe. I think we need to identify as a state how much capacity we need. We need to bring those numbers down to a local level, and then we need to drive to reach those numbers. That's one thing. I think secondly, regarding homelessness while in care, this issue of young people not being able to secure a SILP is very significant. And we do now have a permanent housing navigation program that can help with some of that. But the question is that SILP payment adequate to actually secure and housing? And so in the last 2 years, we've had a housing supplement for the THP NMD program and a housing supplement for the THP program, which reflects the fact that the cost of housing is dramatically different in Del Norte versus Santa Barbara. And so, thinking about that, should we be taking that same approach to the SILP payment? Because young people in foster care, that's what they have to live. And how can we expect a young person in these two radically different housing markets to maintain housing stability? I guess one just last thing I'll say, because I want other, is really moving away from what I think of as high stakes eligibility. Right now, it doesn't serve young people, and we hear so regularly from young people about it. I wasn't a foster youth at the right moment. I wasn't in care at 16, so I can't be a next up. I wasn't in care at 18, so I don't get extended foster care. I wasn't in care at 18, so I don't get THP plus. We need to revisit this, and we need to think more broadly. And I'm a pragmatist, and I understand there need to be eligibility criteria, but this is not serving young people. And there are other places that are revisiting this. For example, New York State, there are circumstances under which a young person may remain in foster care after age 21. We've had 10 years of these general approaches. We can now take our practice to a higher level and accommodate young people on a more individual level. That is what families do for their own children, and that's where what we need to do for every foster youth in California. There's really not that many of them. There's only about 7,500 18 to 21-year-olds. So this is something we have the money to do, and we have the capacity to do. And I hope in 10 years, we can look back on extended foster care and say, this is the decade where we actually started to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. One thing before we move, we've got a ton of audience questions, y'all. So I'm going to jump to those real quickly. One thing we've talked about, though, or talked around a little bit that I'd like to punt to Mark is UBI, adding UBI to the safety net for foster youth. And a bill recently passed to pilot such a program. Mark, you have recently, advocated for a guaranteed basic income for foster youth, and wondering if you can just share a little bit about why you think that is an element that would be so helpful.
First of all, it reflects, if we're viewing these young people as, our young adult children, which I think institutionally is the case, and you look at what young adults in this country rely on their parents and their families for, they're able to rely on their parents and their families for direct aid in terms of cash, childcare, a variety of things well into their 20s. So just from that standpoint, why would we behave differently as, institutional parents, which we are through the system? But the other thing is, I think that the research, both the Midwest study and the Cal Youth study, a lot of people ask me, what is it about extended foster care that makes a difference? And I would say the main thing that makes a difference is that extended foster care helps young people meet their basic needs. And because their basic needs are met, they're able to do other things. They're able to spend time to deal with issues they've had to deal with that haven't been remediated by their time in the child welfare system. They're able to go to school and actually go to school without running up a lot of debt. It's amazing how little debt the young people in California that we've been following who've gone to college have. They've very little, right? That's a function of the fact that even though the self payments are inadequate, all the observations have been made here, young people are faring a lot better than if they didn't have that help. So UBI it looks a whole lot like a SILP to me. There are limits to a SILP, but it is providing cash assistance, which will allow young people to continue to do the things they're doing. The Midwest study and Cal Youth are showing that young people, we asked those, have you been in college since the last time we talked to you, or school? Yes. Have you left? Yes. Why do they leave? Money is the primary reason, and having children they have to care for is the second reason, right? So I think that it makes a lot of sense to at least offer that as young people transition out of these former systems. If we're going to, stop in care, court supervised care, I do think we should evaluate that, though. We should see to what extent a cash assistance alone suffices, or are there ways to, again, provide other kinds of help to young people that will help them better take advantage of that economic support.
Wonderful. And we should have a better sense of that data in just a few years with this new law in California.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on to audience questions for our last 10 minutes here. And the first one is going to go back to you, Mark, so don't mute yourself just yet. Richard Barth at the University of Maryland School of Social Work is interested in two soft outcomes. Do you feel connected? Well, and I guess these are directed at the youth. Did the youth feel connected to a family of origin or a foster family? And did the researchers ask the question about whether they were satisfied with their experience of being in foster care?
Sure. So those are great questions that Rick asked. The answer to the first one is yes. We asked the questions a bit differently in this study than I did in my earlier study. My earlier study, 3/4 of the young people were connected to one or more, were very close to one or more adults in their family. We asked way more detailed questions this time about their social support network, and relatives, kin, extended kin are the most common form of social support for these young people. And I encourage you to look at the report. It's actually really rich data. It describes how much support they feel they have in terms of tangible support, emotional support, advice and guidance, and also who the people are they're turning to. They have relationships with former foster parents less frequently, like 1 out of 10 if you get out very far after they're out of care. But again, those people are important. They're just not as commonly important. With respect to satisfaction, I've been asking a question that has been asked since Trudy Festinger did a study like this in the 70s in New York. A simple question. I feel lucky to have been placed in foster care. About 2/3 of young people in our study answer that question affirmatively. And then over and all, there's a sort of overall satisfaction question, and it's not quite that much. It's a little less than 3/5 of them view their experiences in foster care favorably. But there's a group, maybe like 1/4, that view it unfavorably. But they're particularly favorably disposed toward their foster parents, but even their social workers. More than half of them really view their experience with social workers favorably. And those in group care, more than half of those express positive attitudes toward the group care providers they have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to just go down the list now. Janay, Heather Powell would like to know, what do you think was the most helpful resource to you as you transitioned out of care, and something that was not present at the time that would have been helpful, other than I'm imagining AB 12 as a whole?
Yeah, so very long ago, just want to preface that. I'm definitely not a young person anymore. And one of the things that was extremely helpful is I was able to receive a housing voucher. So we didn't have AB 12, obviously, but we did have housing vouchers. So I was able to receive that, and that was extremely helpful. I was also connected to exactly what Mark was just saying. I was connected to my birth family. And so they were an amazing support for me, that I had a safety net. And even outside of the birth family, I also had a social worker at the time that understood lifelong connections. And so I was also connected to mentors who were extremely supportive and actually developmentally understood what I was going through and all of the things that happen in transition, right? And so I would say that I also saw a question in the chat that talked about being connected to a mentor or one person, a lifelong adult, extremely so necessary and needed, and actually something that should be focused on more, an extension of foster care, irregardless. But I will say that the housing voucher was extremely helpful. I was in college, and so it was great to have that. And just the support of my community, the support of the people who I knew were actually connected me and truly unconditionally had love for me, right? And without that, I definitely would not have been had the experiences that I had, and actually be able to move on in my life to be that thriving 35-year-old, right? And I think that that's something to mention as well, is we talk about, youth, our young adults living at home and going back home, and extending programs to 25 and 26. The proof is there. And that's for young people who are with their families and haven't experienced the foster care system. And so to me, it's, if we really want to support young people in developing to be the thriving 35-year-olds, then we need to make sure that they're connected to people who care for them, that are not based on eligibility requirements in a system or a program, but are actually connected to who they are, where they come from, and a community that's waiting to support them.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a couple questions about increasing folks' willingness to participate. Susan McKendry says, as a CASA, I'm concerned about what we can do to lessen the number of foster youth who walk away from all the non-minor dependent opportunities for support when they turn 18. They know about it, but just can't get to see how much of a lifeline this can be. Amy, any thoughts on?
Well, I definitely want to validate that person's experience. Kind of mathematically, it's not as common as most young people do elect to participate in foster care. But I think we see from Mark's data, the more time they spend in foster care, the better. And so getting them to opt in and getting them to stay in, either because they want to or because they can, back to the issue of having stable housing that they can live in. And so, in my experience working with young people, the best way to do that is have something that's worth it for them. We spend a lot of time talking about how youth are different than adults in our conversations of housing. And these young people, if it's not of quality and if it's not decent, it's not good, they're not going to utilize it, and they shouldn't, frankly. And so, the short answer is let's offer them something great, something that they see a good future in. But again, we do see most young people do elect to remain in care. And I think the goal is to try and, have them, remain in care for as much of it as possible to get that full exposure so they can get the positive outcomes that Mark outlined.
Wonderful. And to keep you on the spot, Amy, in terms of offering something great, and also what you were talking about earlier about the low payments for SILPs, Aaron Connor is wondering, do you think California would be open to putting up funds to increase those payments, especially the SILP payments?
Well, it's certainly an argument that has resonated for the last 2 years with housing programs. Now, it gets to a whole nother level when you look at SILPs because they're the most prevalent placement. So I'm not sure 100%. I mean, we have very specific and data on housing costs, from the federal government, FMR, fair market housing. I really don't know, but I think it's something we should really be looking into, costing out, and seeing if we could kind of leverage the success of those two previous supplement approaches to bring it to the supervised independent living placement. One thing I do, if I could add, Sarah, before I know time is short, that I definitely wanted to add is really challenging ourselves to look into outcomes by race and ethnicity. This is something that, we talk about foster care and we talk about foster youth kind of as a monolith. And of course they're not, there's a lot of different experiences within foster care. And at JBay, we have really challenged ourselves to start doing that. Just in one of our programs, we do something called the FAFSA challenge. And we looked at outcomes in terms of FAFSA completion rates by different categories. And we found that African-American youth, foster youth, were not completing them at the same rates. And so that's just kind of one thing I wanted to get in. Again, for job one is looking at as overall, I think, but job two, as we move forward, is drilling in deeply, which I know a lot of Mark's data does, but even in our practice to understand, are things equitable from that point of view? So I did want to just raise that because it's a high priority, I know, for us all.
Absolutely. Amy, I really appreciate you bringing up that point. Thank you for adding that to the discussion. We are coming up to the end of the hour. Before we all sign off, I'm going to ask Jordan one more question. You talked about the importance of extended foster care being youth-centered, and Lisa Spivey wants to know what specific changes could help make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say definitely not limiting the dreams and aspirations that young people have when are in extended foster care. Actually last weekend, I had a camping trip with a lot of my friends who I met through NFYI, CCA, AI, and CYC. And one thing we noticed is that we were really pushed to higher education, and we had other dreams and aspirations. And we were going into the survival mentalities, like to set a foundation, not only for ourselves, but future families, like where can we obtain the stability? I remember individuals sharing, like, I couldn't study abroad because I needed to stay in this placement. I couldn't get the job or be a musician because I had to stay in school to qualify for AB 12. And so it was just astonishing of like how we, even though in the eyes of the system, we were viewed as successful, we had to limit our dreams and aspirations to be where we're at right now. So, being a foster parent, that's one thing I do push to the youth I'm taking care of, like really apply for extended foster care, even if you don't wanting to go to higher education to go, but to have these dreams, but also like not limiting, because that was times like, oh, Jordan, you can't do that, or that, that's not feasible, or hey, that's not the right path because you'll lose these services. And I understand because we're navigating all these eligibility, but when we start limiting the youth where to dreams and what they accomplish, then we're putting them into a box into being another statistic. So being youth-centered, giving that power, what is their dream aspiration? What is their goal path? That doesn't have to be outlined, that will be, looking good in the eyes of the judge when they go to their court hearing.
Jordan, that could not have been a more perfect end to this hour. Thank you so much for putting that beautiful cap on this conversation. A huge, huge thank you to all of you, wonderful panelists. You have brought so much light to this conversation, unpacking this hugely important program. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Your questions were amazing. I am so sorry that we weren't able to get through all of them. Hopefully we can have round two someday soon and talk more about this. And finally, one last word of thanks to the Walter S. Johnson and Louis L. Borg Foundations for the support. Everybody, thank you for making this wonderful. I've enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed it too. And with that, take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.